𝗪𝗡𝗟𝗡.
Guys, welcome back to the podcast. We have a very, very special guest, Dr. Dean Radin. Thanks for being here. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you.
All right. That's good. So I'm going to start this off. I'm not going to geek out too much, but since you don't know the story of how I know you, how I've come across your research, et cetera. You could go ahead and start there. How you've gone to that, what your kind of goal is and has been, and all the research that you've done.
It is one of the first questions I usually get because I'm involved in an unusual scientific discipline, and people always want to know, how did you end up doing that? So in my case, one of the ways I explain it is that while Harry Potter was not a thing when I was growing up, there were many other tales like that, tales of the supernormal and the psychic powers and all that stuff, which saturates entertainment back then, meaning for me, the 50s and 60s. But it's no different today, except maybe even more today. So I'm one of those kids who read the equivalent of Harry Potter back then and just never grew up. But what I mean is that you can maintain a certain sense of childhood appreciation of the wonders of everything. And in many cases, people who go into science, that they do retain their curiosity. That's what drives you in science. So my curiosity was sparked by reading books about fairy tales and the mystic masters of the Far East, as well as all of the television shows that had psychic components, and wondering, could any of that actually be real? And of course, even as a child, you can recognize the difference between fantasy and reality, but there still felt like this is not complete fantasy. This is based on something. Otherwise, It wouldn't draw people's attention that way. So when I was 12 or 13, I discovered that there was a branch of science that actually does study these phenomena and tries to gauge whether or not when somebody has a psychic experience, whether it's telepathy or clairvoyance or whatever, is it just coincidence? Or is it a misremembered event or completely confabulated? What is this? So within parapsychology, the tools primarily of psychological science, but also psychophysiology and physics, have been applied to study, are these things real or not in laboratory conditions? And so I was fascinated by all of that because I was interested in science too. And so I saw now there was a way to connect science with these kinds of experiences, which are, from a mainstream scientific perspective, pretty much ignored. It's either
Totally.
completely dismissed or ignored, which I always felt was very, very odd because they're very commonly reported. So why is science not paying attention to something that so many people are interested in and even experience themselves? Part of my job, having a background both in engineering and psychology, was the interaction of people and machines. Like, what happens? And every lab in the world has laboratory lore, which has been encapsulated in the form of Murphy's Law. So Murphy's Law says that if anything can go wrong, it will. And it'll go wrong at the worst possible time. So we see this at Bell Labs, we'd see this in every other place I've worked. We've seen that when somebody really, really has to have something work, like during an important demonstration or something, it will invariably fail. And even in a more mundane situation, people want to make a photocopy, and that's the moment that the paper runs out or just the thing jams, it doesn't work. So I said, look, most of the time you can figure out when a machine fails, you can deconstruct it and find out why it failed. About 95% of the time. But 5% of the time you can't. We at the Bell system at the time, we used computers that were triply redundant, because these are the computers that were controlling how a telephone got from here to there, how to make the connections. And they would fail sometimes. So our job is to figure out, well, why are these things failing? And I proposed that maybe it fails sometimes because the human operators are angry that day. In other words, a mind...
That didn't go over well, did it?
Well, no, actually, that when you come down to trying to figure out every possible solution for why a triply redundant machine fails, and you can never get the full answer, you start looking for more exotic answers. So I
Sure,
simply say,
sure.
well, what if this were true? That the mind and the matter can interact directly. So I just started doing experiments on that and convinced myself that there really was an effect. It's a very tiny effect, but you don't need it to happen too often to screw up a computer that's causing the switching to fail. So I was doing those experiments, went to a conference and presented it, and attracted the attention of people in the US government who had a classified program doing this sort of work. So they invited me to join that program, and I did. And it was at that point, I was around 32, maybe 33 years old. At that point, I decided that if it was possible to continue working as a scientist in that field, that's what I wanted to do. Because
Right.
within the classified program, I had met people who were much more talented than not only anyone I had previously met in terms of their psychic ability, but I didn't even know that those kinds of talents were even possible. I'm talking about remote
I'd be
viewing.
remiss. Okay, I'd be remiss if I didn't get you to explain what it is that they were doing that was so talented. And one thing that I wasn't clear for me. So you were actually having an effect on the machines. It was you that was actually, when you were in your early days, when you were trying to manipulate the machine to see what's going on. Were you the person who was having an effect? Because when you say I went to, within this classified program, I met people with talents that exceeded what I believe possible and myself. Did you mean that you had also attempted to figure out if you yourself were having an effect, or were you testing other subjects?
Every time I've done an experiment from graduate school and on, I've always used myself as a subject. And it's
Wow.
partially so that you want
Okay.
to make sure that the experiment is doing what you designed it to do. By saying that I met people who had much more talent, I mean way more talent than I have.
Okay.
So because I mean, otherwise, if
On a consistent basis, meaning that they are able to replicate the considerably more than above average, or where that should be, you know,
not
considered
only replicate,
chance.
but a level of accuracy, because the government program was primarily interested in espionage, and so they were using remote viewing, otherwise known as clairvoyance, for espionage
Sure.
to describe something happening on the other side of the planet. So the usual way that you'd get that kind of information is that the remote viewer would be asked to sketch something. So you'd get a spy satellite picture of a place that has a building, and the question would be, what's going on inside that building? Because we don't have any
Mhm.
human intelligence on the ground. The satellite can't see it. We want to know what it is. So the remote viewer would target that location. And by the way, blind. They didn't know that that's what it was, because you don't want to
Right.
do what's
Tell them
called.
that it's Egypt and the pyramids
Yeah,
or
then they're gonna
whatever.
make up
Yeah.
stories about it. So they're
Right.
targeted blind, but then they're asked to draw a picture of what you think is going on there. Sometime in the future, with any luck, you will have human intelligence there, or it'll come out historically, and you'll figure out, and that's how you do the match between what they were describing, sometimes in incredible detail, that turns out to be exactly what was actually happening at the time, or in some cases, what would be happening in the future, because these things are not locked in space or time very tightly. There's a lot of
So you're saying that they would lock in sometimes to a position, and perhaps they wouldn't actually tell them what's going on right now in the current time that they are in, but possibly something that would happen 5 years down the road or at some
yeah,
point, and then obviously we would have confirmation for that later.
right.
So
Or
yeah.
like in a famous case where 𝗪𝗂𝗯𝗀𝗃𝗀𝗃 was one of the Army people who was a good remote viewer. He was asked to what was happening inside a building, and he described a huge submarine that was being built, but it wasn't next to the water, so it didn't make sense, and people didn't believe it at the time. But nevertheless, a gigantic submarine was being built. And then he looked in the future, like 9 months from then to the future. And so what Joe saw was that they would finish building the submarine, and then they would build a channel so they could get the submarine from the building to the ocean, which was nearby but not connected. And that is what happened. And that turned out to be what was later called a Typhoon class submarine, which was much larger than any other submarine at the time.
Okay. Yeah, that's. I mean, people have heard that. I've read a decent amount. I've never tried to do. There are plenty of exercises where one can do remote viewing and all sorts of stuff. And obviously, you stumble upon this when you meditate. If you meditate for a long enough period, things that you can't explain, whether or not they're truly paranormal in a certain sense, is obviously hard for just one observer to know. You kind of question and doubt: did that really happen? Did I see that flash, or did I, you know? You have feelings of weightlessness and all sorts of things. Obviously, you're well aware of siddhis and all of the stuff that can happen within that. But I guess my question would be, and even though you haven't entirely explained everything, what have you found that separates those people? Have some of them, through rigorous practice, did Joe just get lucky in the lottery, or do we all have this? I know this is a question you've kind of attempted to answer, or maybe you feel you have answered it, and maybe that was real magic, where you offered a bit more practical, you know, practice or logic to what was going on between people. But how do you feel on that, or where do you stand on that now? Is there a way some of us, and many of the people listening now are athletes, and so I always throw an athletic question: is, could I learn how to do this and benefit my game? Could I learn how to do this and benefit my memory? Or I'm very much into languages. Could I do this and uh, amplify my ability to concentrate by a ridiculous unheard? Have you seen things like that, etc.? I guess that would be where I'd love to know what you found.
So I'll send the question back to you by saying, if a random person on the street says, "I want to be a professional soccer player, can I do it?" And you know that the answer is largely you have to have natural talent to begin with, otherwise you're not going to be a professional. And that is true for
Yeah,
every profession in the world. You have to have a predilection for it, you have to have a passion for it, and you need to be, in your case, certainly, both physically and mentally able to do the task. And it's no different in this domain. So Joe McMonagle has probably a genetic basis for this. His sister also was highly psychic, uh, and an enormous amount of practice, and a passion and an interest. All of it has to come together, and then he's world class. Whereas
sure.
the average person off the street, just selected at random, probably can do it to some extent, but only to the same extent that anybody can learn the rules of playing soccer and they can kind of do it.
Uh-huh.
But that doesn't mean they're
Uh-huh.
going to be a professional at it.
Sure. Which then begs the question: then, over the course of time and of history, we must have had people that have been absolutely extraordinary
Yep.
within their abilities. So it begs the question: some of these stories that we've heard, are they true? And even more interesting to me, and I read, and I'm not sure where I read this, so I won't be able to pull from the source exactly, but that the Chinese government, or over in China, there was a specific book where they had children. They were able to to identify children with some sort of abilities, and they were either taking them immediately and putting them obviously in classified programs or things like that. And I wonder, with being an American and all that they do to maintain their level of power and to be at the head of, whether that's technology, sports, all the rest, do we have superstar psychic level, ability athletes or talents, as you can say, around now? Do we know who they are, or are they locked away in the government, and we're testing and we're trying to figure out how to enhance them and give that to our soldiers, let's say, for instance? Do you have any understanding of that?
If there was a classified program, I'm no longer in that world, so I have no answer to that. I don't know.
Sure.
What I could say is I hope so, because
Uh-huh.
it's true that you can find some level of talent that you can see in a laboratory in about 0.5%, like 0.5% of the population selected at random will be talented enough to be able to see it in the laboratory fairly easily.
Uh-huh.
Many more people, probably 50 or 60%, you can actually get results, but you need to run lots and lots of trials with lots and lots of people to be able to see it, because the effects are small and variable. So when you get down to the 0.5%, or probably even less than that, like 1,000th of 1%, that sounds really small, but not when you multiply by 8 billion. That means that there are
Right.
thousands of people out there who would probably match the historical records of Merlin, or the
Right.
mythical equivalent of Merlin. So
Mm,
what's happening with those people? Well, among other things, they would know that you're coming 2 weeks ahead of time and a mile away. And if they don't want to be found, which is very likely the case, you will never find them.
I see.
For one
I mean,
thing,
that's fascinating.
it would be dangerous, right? There, I mean, it is when you have somebody who is able to perceive anything anywhere. There are all kinds of governments out there who would find that person to be very dangerous and they would want to get rid of them. Well, they'd be able to escape the bad people coming after them, but then you end up living in a cave in the Himalayas or something.
Sure.
Or you become Elon Musk, or you become some
Huh.
other highly successful person in doing apparently amazing business, entertainment, whatever it is, and they probably know they have those skills, but they won't admit it because it's dangerous.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, I've always been fascinated with that. To think that your everyday guy could possibly hold this amazing talent as well, and just keeps it kind of under wraps. And I tend to think that there may be something to that, given that when I've spoken to people who have had certain dream experiences, or I have a couple friends who also have had not just lucid dreams, but also a fairly decent amount of out of body experiences, spontaneous, that they had while they were growing up and while they were younger. And they actually thought everyone dreamed like this. They thought that's how, and it was only until they got a little older and were like explaining to people that they could control their dreams every night, or that they were floating out of their bodies, 5 out of 7 days a week, and talking to people, and they're like, no, I just, when I sleep, I go to sleep, I wake up in the morning, and maybe a fracture of my dream I remember. So I tend to think it's very possible, obviously, that that could be true. I'm really curious if you could, and it's something that I do understand, but you will have a very good understanding of this. The random number generator that's used to get an understanding of, for instance, if I remember correctly, like when 9/11 happened, it was showing irregularities. Um, I love citing this, but I can't explain it well. So I'm hoping you will be able to better than I can. I think you've tested it, if I'm
Oh
correct.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah. So we use first of all, a random number generator is an electronic circuit that does the equivalent of flipping coins. They're programmable, so you can have ones today that'll flip 100,000 bits per second, or even more, 1 million bits per second. They're called truly random because the source of randomness is not a computer program. It's not like a line of code, but it's traced to some physical event. So in the early days, a random number generator used radioactive decay times. When a particle is emitted by a radioactive substance like uranium, the time that it's emitted is considered within quantum mechanics to be fundamentally random. There is in That in turn means there is no cause for why this thing happened. It's not determined. So the electronic circuits that are used in most modern random number generators go back to a quantum event. It's not radioactive decay, but it's something called electron tunneling. And electron tunneling is that an electron has a certain charge in it, and if you try to push that charge against a barrier that's a higher charge, it can't go through. Except it does go through. And so from a classical perspective, it's getting through something it can't get through, but it tunnels because electrons have both particle and wave-like characteristics. So the wave can get
Sure.
through things that the particle can't. And so when
Right.
it pops through, it's the electron tunneling effect. It creates something called shot noise, and you can amplify that and use it to create truly random bits. So
Okay.
the reason why you do that is because part of the from an experimental point of view, what you're looking for is a system that needs an extremely small amount of energy or influence in order to change its behavior. Because while there are stories of people levitating, the amount of force necessary to do that is gigantic. So, and we don't find people who can do that and come to the lab. Maybe somebody can do it, but they're not coming to our lab. So We need something that's a lot simpler. So we need a kind of force, and I'm going to put that in quotes because it's probably not force, but it's something like that,
Sure.
that can push an electron. So you don't need much energy to do that. So the random number generator is a way that the computer can keep track of every single bit coming along, and you can do it for a very long period of time. And one of the hypotheses then about the nature of consciousness, in particular focused attention, is that it is a kind of cohering force or principle. It makes things cohere. And so a random number generator by design and by definition is completely the opposite of that. It has no focus and no coherence, completely unpatterned.
So
So
it's a blank slate in that sense, waiting to be.
it is statistically considered maximum entropy. It is the maximum
Maximum
randomness
entropy.
that a thing
Okay.
can be. Whereas
All right.
we generally are not. I mean, we can have random behavior and so on, but when we have focused concentration on something, when you're out there on the field and you're focusing on the goal or whatever it is, that is not random. You're highly focused. The question then is that mental state able to change this maximum entropy state that is being produced by the random number generator? By simply, rather than focusing on the ball, you focus on a random number generator with the same level of concentration. Would it cause it to change in some way? So those experiments went on for about 50 years, where you'd ask an individual to intently concentrate at the random number generator in a certain way, like make it produce more 1 bits or more 0 bits, or do nothing, and then see, does it actually change in accordance with the instruction? And the answer is yes, it does, to a tiny
Wow.
little extent. But
Uh-huh.
if you collect enough data from enough people, you can see over the long term, it is going in the direction of the instruction.
Wow.
So based on that half century of experiments, hundreds of experiments, uh, a colleague of mine got the idea that maybe it wasn't just intention, but just focused attention, because focused attention is already a kind of coherence, right? I mean, if you're either scattered your attention all over the place or you're focusing narrow. So he did an experiment where he would go to groups that were doing something that was in the group sense coherent, like a meditation in a group or
Okay.
people playing a game. Soccer would be an example of high coherence among the team players. Um, and theaters and all kinds of things that where their attention is getting pulled into the same direction. He put a random number generator in the vicinity without telling him what was going on, just to see would it change, and the answer is yes, it does. So that gave rise to an experiment that's been running continually now since 1998, which we call the Global Consciousness Project, where we have random number generators in cities around the world. At one time, there were 75, I think, in 75 cities. Now it's about 25. And we looked for large-scale events like acts of terrorism or positive events like the opening ceremony of the Olympics. So the valence of it could be positive or negative, but tens of millions to hundreds of millions of people paying attention to one thing at the same time. And then we get all of the data, which is recorded continuously from the random generators, and we get asked the question, when the world's attention is highly focused, does some aspect of the physical world change as reflected by what's going on in these random generators? And the answer is yes, it does change. So again, it's from a physical perspective, it's a pretty small effect in terms of magnitude, but because we have a huge amount of statistics on this, the results of a formal test in the Global Consciousness Project after 500 events, it took 20 years to get there, but after 500 major events, we get a 7 sigma result. That means 7 standard errors away from chance. The probability of that is 3 trillion to 1. So we have very high statistical
Okay.
confidence that
Right.
some aspect of the world changes when the world's mind becomes coherent and focuses on something. And it's a worldwide version of what we've done in the laboratory. It works in both cases.
I mean, so much to. I would ask on the sense of, and I think you laid this out in one of your books as well. You mentioned intention and attention, And I think you kind of put together a recipe for what was needed to make that change within. Is that it? It's simply in order to, and I'm trying to squeeze it down even from the Global Consciousness Project into someone in their everyday life, and what meditators do and what they try and train, what they're really training when they focus the actual, I mean, obviously, so I train my soccer or football all the time and constantly playing, but what are meditators? Is this what they're truly exercising when they're just trying to say focus on their breath? Is this the same? Is that's attention? Your intention is something where I'm feeling this, or how what I intend to do. What's the separation there? And is there something else missing in that little recipe that would allow someone to then change their world or to have an effect on the physical world, whether big or small?
So attention is talking about attending to something. It's simply the act of focusing upon without intention. So intention means that you are attending, but you also have a desire. You have a will. You want something. So that's what the intention is. It's an additional spin on the attention. So the attention is simply, you can imagine that this is the flashlight model of attention, where you can pay attention to a wide area, or you can kind of focus it down, pay very close attention to one
Sure.
thing. So that's like how wide your flashlight is and where do you point
I
it.
see.
The
So you want
intention,
laser point attention in that sense. It's focused on
sometimes,
this and not ignoring this. Okay, sometimes.
yeah, like if somebody who's involved, like a police officer maybe, or a jet pilot, they need situational awareness. They need to be paying attention to everything, because you don't
I
want to
see.
miss something that's happening off to the side. So depending on the context, you either want wide situation awareness or a highly focused awareness. So the thing in meditation, it's slightly different in that you want to get to a point where you're not trying to do anything, right? So if you think about the act of concentrating, that requires a certain amount of effort, because it's not easy to pull down your concentration and focus on one thing. If you
Right.
try to do that, it's self-defeating within a meditative state. So there, it's like Yoda said, there is no try, there is do or not do. So you get to that strange internal state of effortless striving. You are
Right.
concentrating, but with no effort at all. And it takes a while to figure out what that even means, but nevertheless, that's where you're going. And then it becomes a completely effortless task, but it could have extremely high concentration at the same time. So that's quite different than everyday
Sure.
way of being.
Yeah.
So once you learn how to do that within a meditative state, you have this effortless striving, high focus. You then put an intentional spin on it, which is I want this. Again, with no effort and no anxiety, which is not easy to do. But those are the states within magical traditions, for example, of how do I affirm something that will actually be more likely to occur. It's not guaranteed to occur, but you can increase the probability of it. That's what we see in these experiments. You increase the probability of a certain outcome through focused attention without anxiety, plus an intentional, I think of it as a spin. The
Sure.
intention itself is like a stable laser beam. It's just there, doesn't do anything. But if you spin it, you're now making it do something.
I see. I see. It makes I mean, uh, we've been hearing things like this from the ancients and from different stuff and from different books, different texts for many, many, many years, uh, which is perfect because it leads me to my next question about something that I'm sure you've encountered, or I know you have, at least to a certain degree. The dogma that exists within the current paradigm for the mentality that we have within society, obviously one which is rather materialistic in its nature, in the sense that the materialist worldview, let's say, is the dominating worldview uh, of today. Why is it that I'm of the sense of you. Obviously, you're not saying you know all the answers. You don't know what it is, but you clearly feel that it's something that needs to be researched, and that's what you're doing. I'm of the same sense, is that it would appear that something beyond what we truly understand is going on, but we tend to kind of shy away from it. And I'm curious if you know why that is, or if we are going to. And I do feel as if even in these times that in this past 10 years, it does feel like it's shifting to a point where we're discussing it more and there's more avenues for someone to get into it. But I'm curious if you know, are we going to get to the point where we are openly speaking about this as if, or, and it's very possible that governments and obviously in other classified programs, they are acting as if it's a norm, if it's normal. And possibly it was for you in the remote viewing world where this is a fact, and it's not a fact for the majority of the world. I think we have a tendency to say, yeah, that could be something, but I would imagine our world would entirely change and flip upside down if everyone had a true understanding of what the mind is capable of doing, even on a small, infinitesimally small level, what that means and how you can affect your world and what you can do, and what sort of technology we might even try to create to amplify, which was going to be another one of my questions. But I'll stick with the dogma question first before I go into, is there a way to amplify this with technology, and have we done so? So yeah.
Right. So, given that these kinds of experiences are very common, given that belief is the majority of people in the world believe in one or more of these kinds of phenomena, including scientists and engineers, they also have a majority belief. Then why is this not covered in the 15,000 institutions of higher learning around the world? There's roughly 30 or 40 universities where there's a faculty member who's interested, but that's out of millions and millions of faculty members, most of whom might privately believe, but they've been taught not to talk about it. So, well, why is that? Well, one reason is that some religions say this is the work of the devil, and so you ignore it for that reason. And there's pressure applied to not do this. Other religions say this is great, but it's religion and it's not science. And science and religion are not very comfortable partners with each other. So in the academic world, generally, even people who are historians of religion or scholars of religion, they would never, almost never, some do, but most would not talk about the religious psychic events that happen. Like the Bible is a listing, it's a taxonomy of different kinds of psychic things. Very few would be willing to say this was actually real. This is how it really worked. Even today, scholars of ancient yogic practices would look at Patanjali's Yoga Sutras and say, oh, well, no, he wasn't really talking about real telepathy and real precognition. He was talking about it in a metaphorical or an allegorical state because nobody believes in that stuff. Well, that comes about because of the prevailing idea, the worldview held by most educated people in the world today, which is materialism, which is extremely successful as a way of understanding reality. It says that everything is based on matter and energy, including your brain, including your mind, including consciousness itself. So if that is true, if that's all there is, it's just material, and at the bottom it's randomness, and there's no meaning or purpose for anything, then these kinds of phenomena that we're talking about are impossible, literally. They cannot occur. That's what people are taught. Like anyone who considers themselves educated today goes through school for 20 years, and then maybe they go on to higher education, and that's what they're taught continually, not usually by saying it in this way. They're taught this principle or a way of viewing reality. And it's very difficult for people to argue against it, except for their own experience. And that doesn't count. So we end up with this worldview, and we've gone through many worldviews in history. This one's particularly powerful because it gives us the technologies that tell us that obviously these things work, right? We couldn't do this interview unless it worked.
Sure.
So what I try to then paint as a picture of what amounts to the philosophy of science, without calling it that, because that would scare people away, The philosophy of science is, and like any philosophy, is about the assumptions underlying a way of viewing reality. Within the academic world today, the assumption is that consciousness, we don't really know what it is, but it's probably something produced by the brain, in which case it's completely limited to your ordinary senses. Our view of reality is produced by local senses in your body. That makes telepathy and clairvoyance and all the rest not possible. But since we know that it is possible, that means that some elements of our worldview today, based on materialism, are simply wrong. And so the reason why I wrote the book Supernormal and then wrote the book Real Magic was to look at other worldviews that have been around for tens of thousands of years. We call them esoteric now, as compared to materialism. And within the esoteric worldviews, all of these phenomena we're talking about now are easy to understand
Normal. Right.
because that's the way the world is. So I think what's happening is science as a method is really powerful, and it's slowly moving in the direction of saying, oh, well, okay, the world is not the way that Newton was describing. It's not even the way that we understood at the beginning of the 20th century. But over the course from the 20th, over that 100-year period, our understanding of what material meant radically changed, as did our understanding of space and time and all of these very fundamental things. They're totally different than they were 100 years ago. And more importantly, they're different in the direction that make them more and more compatible with the experiences that we're talking about. So science is not finished, and physics is certainly not finished. And if you keep going
Sure.
on that arrow, I think we'll eventually begin to converge more and more with some elements of the esoteric traditions. And the way we're going to do that, I would predict then, is that there's something about consciousness which is way more important than we had previously thought. It is not part of physics today, but I think in the future it will be.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Uh, and before I touch on the technological aspect of that question, there is something that you alluded to and I'm not sure which book it was, with the evidence that we have for paranormal abilities and comparing it to, I believe, smoking. Am I remembering this correctly? Or for the dangers of smoking? Am I citing that correctly? Something along the lines of the evidence or the amount of knowledge that we now have based on what you've found, the studies that have been run. We have so much more evidence of that being possible. Of some of these abilities, or regardless, versus how much we know about how bad smoking is for us.
Yeah, you might be referring to a comparison of the effect sizes in the experiments
Okay.
that we do now as compared to the effect size of aspirin. So with aspirin, we know that if you take an aspirin, it will help prevent a second heart attack. And this is based on 50,000 people or so who are involved in this long-term study. The effect is real. It's really small. It's a tiny little effect. So it won't help everybody, but on average, over a long term, yeah, it does something. So by comparison, then one of my books, I mentioned that the effect size for what we can see in the laboratory in terms of telepathy is way bigger than what we accept with aspirin, even though
Sure.
up until recently, we didn't even know how aspirin worked. Well, now we do, but it took 100 years after people were using aspirin to figure out, why does this thing actually work? Well,
Okay.
it's similar then to, we don't exactly know why any of these psychic phenomena work, but we can demonstrate that they do work.
Mhm. Then that brings us right up to the point of, are people trying to enhance this? I mean, clearly people are trying to enhance this, but my question being someone who's actually given a more intellectual look and serious study into this, have you found, are people using technology? Are they blending technology in order to enhance psychic ability in some way? And if you haven't found that, if you don't see that, do you suppose that it would be possible? And, what would you, if you had your dream, all of the money in the world, and you could just, in a second, devise a study, or, get some people together to build something, what would that look like? Would you then have to then still focus through trying to enhance someone's brain capacity, even though consciousness might not be just seated in the brain? Or what sort of contraption would one build or has been built?
So the most effective method historically for enhancing these abilities is meditation. I mean, it's a
Mm.
repeated refrain, but that's the way it is. The other
Mm.
method is psychedelics. So some psychedelics
Oh,
will
okay.
enhance the ability. Unfortunately, they usually also increase the amount of distortion. So it's very difficult to maintain the psychedelic states and get crystal clear accuracy on what's actually happening. There are distortions that mess up the signal.
Mm.
So there are some people now who are using methods like transcranial magnetic stimulation
Mhm.
and DC stimulation and other main ways of manipulating brain activity by either enhancing or inhibiting areas of the brain. And there have been a few experiments to inhibit the frontal lobes in particular, because the frontal lobes are analytical and they tend to get in the way of these kinds of
Okay.
things. So we figured if you zapped the frontal lobes for a while and inhibited it, and then you had somebody do a psychic task, would they do better? And the answer is so far that the evidence does not support that idea. Even though it sounds like it ought to, it's
Sure.
probably more complicated than simply inhibiting portions of your frontal lobes.
Yeah.
Uh, on the other hand, there has been a study by a neurologist who was studying people with lesions in their frontal lobes. So fairly small areas, but nevertheless portions of the frontal lobe of the brain that wasn't working anymore because it was diseased. And he found that certain lesions in certain areas of some of his patients actually did produce an enhancement. Of course,
Huh.
then, but you don't want to go there because then, if you say you want to be really psychic, yeah, well, okay, destroy this portion of your brain. Well, that's not
Hit
going to
your
work.
head, yeah.
But
No,
it
no.
does suggest that there's areas of the brain that really do get in the way. And so, not too surprisingly, when you meditate, what happens to the frontal lobes? Start to become the medial area anyway. It becomes inhibited. The activity goes down. So there's like natural ways of producing this. It doesn't permanently change you. So I think the most likely advancement that's going to come into this area is something that we're working on now, which is based on the idea that every culture in the world throughout history has felt that there are some people from some families who had this ability, and it would stay within the family and sometimes jump a generation. Grandma had it, and Aunt Sally had it. It so this lore is so common that we decided to do a genetics test using modern genetics methods to get DNA from people who we were able to vet as having some talent, who said they were psychic from families who were psychic. And we did
Mhm.
a long-term interviews and vetted that the person was talented, and then we had matched people by gender, age, race who reported nothing about psychic ability. Got their DNA, did a full genome analysis, and we found a difference.
Wow.
So this would not be too surprising if you consider that even relatively subtle things like intelligence, like different forms, not your IQ, but the way that your intelligence expresses. So there's one form called crystalline and another form called fluid. And you can kind of already get the sense that the crystalline intelligence is somebody who's like really good at high detailed mathematics, and fluid intelligence is an artist who is
Creative.
highly
I see.
creative and flexible. So that turns out to have a genetic basis. It's not one gene. Most of these things are not one gene. It's a constellation of hundreds of genes. But with techniques now, you can find these effects. So we did a similar analysis for psychic ability and found actually again it's not one gene, but it's a sequence of genes that we did find that was different between those two groups.
Wow.
Once you find that, then the possibility arises of genetic manipulation, either through pharmaceuticals or for things like gene editing, where
The CRISPR or something like this.
CRISPR can be used to do an
Oh,
epigenetic flip, basically, and
wow.
take somebody who may have the potential and turn it on, and do the opposite as well. So the opposite would be interesting because a number of people have speculated over the years that some people are driven crazy and are diagnosed as schizophrenic because they're so open psychically that they can't tell the difference anymore between their own thoughts and somebody else's thoughts. So you might be able to create a different kind of treatment then for schizophrenia where you just basically turn that off. Like, your
Sure.
internal volume is
Wow.
too high. We're going to turn that antenna down, and then
Uh-huh.
then they're not
Rather
going
than
to be
an
bothered by it.
antipsychotic, pharmaceutical or something like that may have a whole
Well,
host of
not only
side
yeah,
effects.
not only do the standard methods have all these horrible side effects, but they're basically sedatives, right? They're saying, I'm disturbed because I'm hearing voices all the time. Okay, we're going to give you a very heavy duty sedative so that you're basically sleeping all the time. And they don't like that. Nobody would like that.
Yeah, no, of course
Whereas
not.
here, you would be, we think, if this turns out to be true, you might simply be able to turn down the volume there or turn it off completely. Or for somebody else who's not bothered with that, if you take an RNA version of this, where you're not
Mhm.
manipulating the DNA, but just temporarily an RNA, you might be able to make somebody temporarily a super psychic. So we've
That's incredible.
yeah,
Yeah.
so that I would say that's the leading edge right now in terms of what we think is possible for true enhancement.
Uh-huh.
And we've submitted a paper. It's under review now, which describes what we did and what we found. Hasn't been accepted yet, so I can't point to a publication, but it'll eventually get out
Sure,
there.
sure. I mean, yeah, okay. Well, I'll definitely be following for that. Does that mean are you writing a book? Will you be writing something new in the there's been a little space. I'm not sure if you have do you have anything in the works, and what is that? Is it going to be detailed with what you're researching now, or do you have something you might want to be getting into?
Well, after I finished Real Magic, lots of feedback was for people who want to know more. What do they do? How can I use this? So I've
Right.
been toying with the idea of a book on practical magic. It's
Okay.
ancient esoteric magic for the modern mind, something like that.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
and I've done a little work on that, but I don't have a contract on it or anything. I haven't really pursued it
Sure,
very
sure.
hard because I have a lot of other research that I'm doing, and I don't like to. I mean, I've written a book about every 5 years because to do it right takes at least 6 months of just high concentration on
Okay.
that one thing,
Uh-huh.
and I don't like to do that for more
Yeah.
than about every
Big
5 years.
commitment. Yeah. Yeah. Well, then, with that being said, and given what that you use yourself as a test subject in all of your research originally and stuff like that, so with something like this, do you meditate? Do you use this to help your research? Do you have a certain practice that you are, entailed in that makes your life better, gives you more peace, reduce anxiety, all that other stuff? Or how do you use that? How do you have a connection? I can imagine your perspective on this is going to be so wildly. You have so much access to knowledge on how this affects the world and affects people and stuff like that. So I'd be really curious in how you've taken that on to yourself, or if you have at all.
Well, I meditate. I first
Mm,
learned to meditate in 1970 as a freshman in college because
okay.
TM was very popular on campuses at that time, and so I took
I've
a
heard
course.
that. Yeah.
I learned very quickly as a result of doing the TM practice that I got pushed into mental places that I didn't understand very well and were kind of frightening. So I dropped it for quite a while. But it
Okay.
taught me at minimum that when you begin to meditate, if you have the right predilection of or talent or whatever, that you can get into strange places pretty quick. So
When you say strange places, what are you necessarily referring to? Places that you might have hidden because of not necessarily trauma, but just like your fears, or is that what you mean? Or
for me, it was mostly perceptual distortions. So
Mhm.
one of the things that could happen in meditation is that you begin to lose the distinction between you and outside of you. Like the inside and outside begins to blur.
Fade, right?
I was unprepared for that. I'd never heard of that before. I didn't know it was happening. But just as one
Yeah.
example, that when I was walking down a corridor after having meditated, when I would breathe, the corridor would breathe. Right? I mean, I
Okay.
feel an inhale and the corridor would expand, and I would exhale and it would contract. And this was not a pleasant thing because I was not taking
Right.
psychedelics. So,
Yeah.
and at the time, the people who were training TM were like 1 year older than me and didn't were not really that practiced. If they had said at the time, "Oh, this is just it's a marker that something is happening. It's probably good. Just keep doing it. Don't worry about it." Nobody said that. So I didn't feel like I wanted to go crazy at the time. And
Yeah.
so over the years, I've tried many different styles, and now I use Vipassana, basically, as
Awesome.
the method.
That's great.
So
That's really cool.
I will be very religious about it and be very disciplined for a while. So as we talk today, uh, every day for the past 7 months. And so, and I know
Wow.
what it feels like internally. It turns down the volume a lot. So I will, especially during a pandemic, not going anywhere, it makes it easy to do this as a daily practice. And so I'll continue it as long as I can.
Yeah. I am also, I had that initial struggle. I wasn't so turned off by the strange things that pop up during meditation. But I had that struggle of starting and then stopping, and then life gets in the way, and training and things like that. But as I've gotten older, it's become such a so crucial to handle and do so much. It's one thing that I wish I could give to the world is the peace. At least, maybe not just the practice. Obviously, the practice and what you gain from it is a great thing. But if you can, there is hardly a person on earth that, if when feeling at the height of a good practice of meditation, if that's consistent, you would ever turn it down again. It's something that even meditators have to be a little weary of chasing, because you get to a point where it's so peaceful, and then you just get your meditation, you're just trying to get back to this point where, there's no problem, there's only joy, or there's only oneness, or all of these different experiences. And so I would love for it would, and especially, you're right, during a pandemic, it's wildly important. But I don't know that we have time. Maybe you have time for one more question. I want to just I would want to touch on one other thing, because I do remember a very interesting story, and you don't have to tell the whole story here. But I'm curious if you're doing anything with synchronicities. And if I remember correctly, you had a very wildly interesting synchronicity, probably based on your location, or maybe one of your labs.
Yeah.
And I've never forgotten that story, and I think it's been quite some time since I've heard it. But are you still doing anything with synchronicities? And for people that don't know what synchronicity, maybe you could explain what that is and why that's significant, or more significant than just chance.
Right. A synchronicity is a meaningful coincidence. So it's called a coincidence in the literal sense that things happen together somehow, but in a very meaningful way. So it certainly doesn't feel like a chance event when it happens to you. And there are many books out there talking about these things in different ways, and with stories that are incredible. So the episode that you're talking about was when I was putting together an office where a group of guys and me were creating a nonprofit business to do research on psi phenomena. It was in Silicon Valley around the time of the .com craze. And so we found a spot, and eventually we moved in. And on the day that we moved in, I noticed that there was a business near us that was called PsyQuest, which was PSI is the short name for what the kind of research we do. And we thought that was an interesting coincidence. At that point, it wasn't the synchronicity, because it was just like, well, we're creating Psi Research Place, and there's a place called PsyQuest, but that could be anything. We thought Psi was Personnel Services Incorporated or something. So a month goes by, and then we notice our office is pretty much bare, and I'm responsible for putting things in it. So I'm spending a lot of my time drawing what I want the rest of the lab to look like, including a laboratory and so on the whiteboard in my office. And one day I walked to work, and I noticed that right next to us is a place that is PsyQuest Labs. So a laboratory next to us of this place that we saw further down that said PsyQuest. I don't know what that is, but it sounds interesting. I should introduce myself, partially because they're a neighbor, and also I want to find out, what is this funny coincidence? So nobody's in there, and I check every day for a month. And then finally I see somebody, like through the mini blinds, I can see somebody in there, knock on the door, opens the door, and I'm going to announce who I am. And I said, hello, my name is, and he finished by saying my name, but he looked shocked. He looked like he was going to fall over. And I was concerned because, first of all, I didn't know how he knew who I was. And second, he didn't look that great. So the reason he was shocked is because he had spent the prior month doing a Tibetan dream yoga practice, which is all about manifesting your desire. So his desire was for me to show up. And when I heard that, of course, I felt completely disoriented because I think I have free will, but I went to the door and fulfilled his desire by simply being there. And so I asked, well, why do you want me to be here? The 𝗪 in that case, the 𝗪 was the same that we were doing. He was creating a business, commercial business, doing research on psychic effects to make products. And he had read some of my books and he wanted to get in touch with me, didn't know where I was. Almost nobody knew that I was in Silicon Valley at the time. Absolutely nobody other than a family member and a few colleagues knew that we were creating this new outfit. And we didn't have 𝗪 on our name. Our name was Boundary Institute, didn't say anything about psychic anything. So he was doing this Tibetan dream yoga practice where you spend 3 hours awake and then 3 hours asleep, and you repeat this over the course of 24 hours. And the idea is that you begin to blur objective reality with dream reality. And during the dream reality, you manifest, because it's easy to do things in dreams. So after 3 or 4 cycles, you get lucid, and then you just pull the thing you want in the dream. And so when he opened the door and I was there, he couldn't tell if he was dreaming or awake. So that's why he was shocked. He thought it was awake, but when you get into those funny lucid states, it's not so easy to tell anymore. So I heard this, and of course, we were both had to sit down for a while to process what happened here. And then he asked if I wanted to see his lab, and of course I did because he's doing some interesting stuff. And so what I had been drawing on the board for the previous month on my whiteboard was what his lab was. So it's what the content and look of his laboratory was on the other side of the wall from where I had been drawing what I wanted. So I was pulling towards me what I wanted, and he was pulling towards him what he wanted. And the two came together as a synchronicity because, in one sense, it's a coincidence, but it's a weird coincidence with multiple layers on it. Where both of us are getting drawn together almost like a gravitational force. And so when people talk about affirmations, there's huge literature of affirmations. Essentially, the way I interpret it is that very strong desire said repeatedly, but without anxiety. It's this strained meditative state again. That kind of intention begins to manipulate the world in some way. Like the nature of physical and mental reality are warped by it, and it can act like a gravitational pull. So, none of us felt like we were pulled to go to this particular office. It just happened to be the one that was available that we could afford. And he had no idea where I was, but nevertheless, he felt I'm pulling him towards me. So I think that in affirmations work when they do is through a similar effect. You're simply warping the nature of reality around you so that you will eventually bang into the thing that you wish.
Right. And it must have something to do with, and I don't know what you felt as if your mental state was while you were even drawing on the board, but as you mentioned, it's not this strict concentration. And even in a non-esoteric way, most of us know that if you really try and force yourself to try and draw the thing or cook the food, it never turns out correctly.
Right.
There's some sort of flow that needs to, some sort of relaxed state. And people shy away from saying meditation and mindfulness is the new key buzzword to not offend, but still at its core, you're talking about this state, this mindful, relaxed flow state that can create something like that. I mean, obviously to call that, it's really hard. And it's even, I can understand the significance of that because it just seems like something that is just madness. How is it possible? He doesn't know you're there. And then that extra layer of you drawing the lab puts it beyond. I guess it's kind of possible that there's two side things over here, but after you start adding up the layers, it's just ridiculous. You have to imagine that there's something else there. And so I find it interesting for people. I know personal experience, and when someone has a synchronicity like this, I'm sure, I don't even know if you did, but you might have doubted it at first a little bit. And then it's just, you've got to get to a point, where you just say, this is something this is a thing that we don't yet understand to at least its full capacity. So I know personal experiences like that. And I've had some very interesting synchronicities myself. And I've even told, at least in another podcast, about one of the best goals that I scored, where I didn't kick the ball. Was played into me, and I ended up kicking it over my head. But the truth of the matter was, I was kind of a little worried before the ball actually reached me. I was having all these thoughts, and I didn't realize how slow time had become. Time had slowed down, and I'm having all these thoughts about, should I head the ball? I know I probably shouldn't head the ball. What time is it? I was having all these thoughts, and then I finally decided at the very last second to take the relaxed position and just said, hey, you know what? I'll just try and settle the ball. I'll just try and relax into it. And when I did that, my leg kicked the ball then over my head, and I scored a goal. It was a very nice goal. It won goal of the year, actually. But I did not actually tell my leg to do it. It happened to me. And that's the best way I can and have of explaining what happened. To an onlooker, it looks like a premeditated play. But in essence, I was just a passenger in this experience where all I did was decide to relax, and the rest just happened. So fairly interesting. But how can people see more, interested in supporting things? I don't know what else you have going on, but is there any place that if people are interested in learning and doing more, besides obviously all of your books, which we'll link to certain things there, what else can they do to find out more about what you're doing?
So I work at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which is noetic.org, noetic.org. So that lists not only what I'm up to, but what the other members of our science team are up to, and the Institute as a whole. Up until the pandemic, we still have a retreat center we call Earthrise, but it's closed down at the moment, where people would run through workshops of various types. We get around 5,000 or 6,000 people a year through those. We hope at some point that will open again, but who knows what's happening at this point.
Yeah.
So the work that I'm up to and those of my colleagues are listed, not usually in the top page, but you can go to the science page and you can see about us and what we're up to.
Okay. Well, awesome. Guys, we will link to everything right there in the description box. If you're watching this on YouTube, it's right there in the description box. Dr. Radin, thank you so much for being here. And we'll definitely try to get you back on whenever that book is coming or whatever else you got going on. So appreciate you being here.
It's my pleasure. And one thing we hadn't discussed, which we might in some future episode, are the psychic and mystical experiences of athletes. Because you're as the example that you just gave was a perfect being in the zone state where you're mentally there and you're not there at the same time, and your body knows what to do. That is as a discipline. You see it in golf. You see it in all kinds of physical activities where the moment you can get your mind out of thinking about the game is where the magic happens. And so not only to you, but even the audience can feel that. Like the one of the prototypical cases here is Michael Jordan, who appeared to defy physics occasionally. Well, that was never tested as far as I can tell, but it sometimes these things happen, and it happens more often in sports than it does in many other domains.
100%. And as a matter of fact, most of the same amount of dogma is there. Most people won't speak about it if it does happen to them. And I've never heard anyone tell me that, but I know for sure, based on what we know about visualization, and that some guys, when they perform well, they're aware that there's some state, there's something you can do to enhance yourself in a way that we truly don't quite get. Right. With this flow state. And it does happen in golf. And I've read books about it happening in American football. And there's even a hilarious story of a goalie in soccer who actually felt as if he saved a bunch of penalty kicks. And he felt as if after the game, he told that he was watching his body from outside of it. And he somehow just knew what to do. And he didn't. So It does happen. So yeah, awesome. We'll definitely have to do that next time. I appreciate you taking the time, and we will see you guys all later. All right. Peace.